If you value Lakeland Public Television's online content, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org. Thank you.
Funding for this documentary was provided by the Minnesota Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Native nations predated the United States of America. When white people first came to Minnesota, there were Native people who owned 100% of the land. They had established their own governments. They oversaw all of their own affairs. And Native people didn't say, could I please become a citizen of the United States and be one of the cultural enclaves amongst many in the United States? That's not what happened. The United States federal government came, usually with their army and so forth, and said, we want your land. And Native people said, well, I don't know about that. And they started a negotiation, which usually resulted in a treaty. And the treaty was the legal mechanism by which this Native nation, with their own pre-existing governance structures, said, okay, we will sell you part of the land. And in return, we will receive, financial compensation, terms, promises, use rights, even to land that's been sold. All of those kinds of things are written into treaties. So when you look at a map like this, it's not that somebody decided to give, the Indians at Red Lake this land. They've always been there. They were there long before the United States existed, long before the state of Minnesota existed. And if they weren't there and didn't sell land to the United States, none of the white people would have been able to live there either.
My name is John Parsons, and I'm on a quest to find out what was really going on in early Minnesota back in the 1800s as treaty after treaty appeared to open the way for immigrants to head west.
Exactly 150 years ago today, the Red Lake and Pembina bands of the Chippewa signed a treaty known as the Old Crossing Treaty. In that treaty, they ceded around 11 million acres of land to the United States of America. Today, we've been invited by the Red Lake Nation to come to the Red Lake Indian Reservation as they commemorate the signing of that treaty. It's really quite difficult to step back in history, isn't it? And to actually see what people then saw. We see through a different lens almost as we look back now. How do you manage to achieve the ability to see through their eyes?
Well, I think you're right. It is sometimes difficult to go back 150 years and think about a historical event or a certain important moment in time and try to understand what was going on with people at the time. I'm a historian, and I'm a historian who studies the history of Ojibwe people in the Great Lakes, but especially from the perspective of family and community life. And so for me, I'm interested in the human story.
I decided to improve my understanding over food, so I invited 3 guests. Historical novelist Candice Simar, who has written about the experiences of Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota during the 1800s. UND professor of French Virgile Benoit, who brings insight into a distinct Aboriginal people group, the Métis, who were silent players at the Old Crossing Treaty negotiations. And Red Lake Nation Tribal Chairman Floyd Jourdain Jr., who has provided a decade of leadership to some 10,000 members of the Red Lake Band of Chippewa in northern Minnesota. In 1863, the Pembina and Red Lake bands of the Chippewa were summoned by Senator Alexander Ramsey to Hewitt, Minnesota, to negotiate what became known as the Old Crossing Treaty. Ramsey's purpose was to acquire land, though he told the Indian chiefs that the Great Father had no special desire to get possession of their lands. He also said, "We do not care much about the land." Yet he told Congress afterwards of the soil being extraordinarily fertile. He also came with Gatling guns. Hewitt, Minnesota used to be close to the heart of Red Lake territory. Now it's almost 2 hours away from the modern-day reservation.
And so to imagine back then what our ancestors went through, to be here for 2 weeks negotiating, and the United States military was positioned over here. And our people were here for 2 weeks. And they knew that in order to move forward and survive as Indian people, that we would have to coexist. They were also realists. They knew that from this point on, our lives will never be the same.
What we want to do today is really to discuss how we feel about that treaty, what that treaty means to the people that we know.
It's always been a bitter pill for the Red Lake Band, to the treaty era and ultimately agreements that ensued. And we've always not really cared for treaties because we have a great respect for the United States. Throughout our history, our band members have served in the military. They've sworn allegiance to the Americas and also the state of Minnesota since it came to be. So we're tri-citizens. But we've also held true, to the allegiance to our own people and passed on the traditions and teachings. And part of them was that the land was very, very sacred to us. And we protect it and maintain it at all costs. And every treaty and agreement that we've entered into, we've all felt like we really didn't have a choice.
While I was in Hewitt, I heard about a remarkable mural depicting the Old Crossing treaty negotiations. Dubbed Old Crossing because they took place at a fording point over the Red Lake River used by Red River ox carts, painted in 1988 by a Métis artist. The Métis people date back to the 17th century when Europeans, predominantly French, but also English and Scottish, came to North America because of the fur trade and assimilated into the First Nations culture. Virgil Benoit explained some themes in the mural for me.
Teepees are almost marginalized and almost gone. They're way on the left, on the edge. And so that's a piece of life that shows that at this moment, it's probably passing away, fading. The skull of the buffalo, right in the center, is also indication that the days of the buffalo are probably also going. What's coming is this horizon, is on the horizon, literally, and it's cultivated fields. He put some gold up in the middle, if you would. That gold could suggest that after the treaty, the land was destined to go into fields. Now, if we start to talk about the creation of the composition of this depiction, that gold is repeated in the soldier's hair, which is a contrast to the darker skinned people, darker complected people who were here before. The land is in a sense changing hands, and it's the nature of the changing of the hands, the authority over the land, that this mural depicts.
At Old Crossing, there were more than 500 Métis present. Ramsay disparagingly called them half-breeds, and they were not invited to participate in negotiations. In Canada, the Métis were recognized officially as Indians in 2013, while in the US, Métis have no distinct status, though some are enrolled members of other federally recognized Indian nations.
The Métis people that I mentioned before that are far on the right are doing things that are not treaty-related. Pulling a catfish from the river, the fellow watching that happen who has a gun, and it inadvertently is pointing at the soldier. But there's no sentiment that he's really attached and looking at that soldier, that he's ready to do anything. His attention is on some other things, I suppose, on what the river can provide or what's happening to that young person who's pulling out a catfish. The other person in the back who's laboring to pull that ox out of the river is also very attached to another reality. It seems like part of the depiction of the artist here is to show that these tremendous pieces of history happen with a great deal of indifference or ignorance of the significance of what they will bring to a lot of the people who surround those things. Also, another message of this is that the artist is a Métis who was very aware of the fact that the Métis had no voice in the treaty.
Virgil Benoit alerted me to the rather dark depiction of U.S. Senator Alexander Ramsay at the heart of this painting.
One looks like a snake oil salesman, if you would. That's probably Ramsay, or it is some sort of spirit of the spokesperson for this treaty, and then Ramsay would be right in back of the fellow. But I think that this must be Ramsay, the fellow with the dark glasses, must be a representation of Ramsay.
I asked myself, is this the elder statesman whose memory is so venerated in Minnesota?
On the one hand, he has a little piece of soil with some grass. That grass is the old prairie grass. The prairie grass is around the buffalo skull. It's in various places down where the people are meeting, up further in the back where you see what's going to come, the cultivated fields. You don't see prairie grass anymore. Look at the clothing of the Métis, and then look at that drab clothing that the negotiators of the treaty are wearing. This colorful past is being sacrificed to this drab future.
We're here at the Bemidji State University American Indian Resource Center, and we're here to meet with Dr. Anton Troyer. Dr. Troyer is the author of these 2 books, and Dr. Troyer has agreed to be my guide around an exhibition that is actually here today called Why Treaties Matter. Dr. Troyer.
Hey there.
Thanks for
nice
meeting
to meet
us.
you. Yeah, my pleasure. And you're just looking at how would you actually translate words like right, title, convey, or how would you translate a legal description to people who had an entirely different concept of their relationship to the land. Like even in Ojibwe, the word debendan, which you would loosely translate as to own something, it doesn't mean to own something, it means to measure it in your mind. There's a way of relating to and understanding a relationship to something. So it sounds strange, you know, it must have been like someone saying, hey, I want to buy this chunk of air around your head right here. You can still stand there, you can still breathe that air. Here's $50, what do you think? And then all of a sudden, someone's pushing you out of the air. It's just kind of like that. And it must have seemed like that for a lot of tribal people in the first round of treaties.
Because their worldviews were so different.
Right.
The issue of conflicting worldviews set me to digging to discover the thought process that gave these early Americans the idea that it was okay to acquire land from indigenous peoples in the way that they did. One view blames the Vatican. Another names the 17th century political theorist John Locke. Both the Pope and Locke are quoted invoking God in support of a disturbing approach that deprived Indian peoples of the very equality espoused in the Declaration of Independence. I've come over here to Seattle to talk to Dr. Robert Anderson, who is a professor of law here at the University of Washington School of Law. And of course, you're known nationally for your work with this particular tome here, Cohen's Handbook of Federal Indian Law, which some people describe as the Bible in this field. For most people, when we come into the question of treaties, we don't really know what treaties are. I mean, we hear the terminology, we understand that treaties are probably something that may be used internationally, but what do we know about them? And I'm hoping that you can help us and help our listeners to really understand what is a treaty.
Well, I'm happy to try. Well, and as you pointed out, they're international instruments originally, and the whole field of federal Indian law as we know it today is rooted in international law that developed as the European colonists were expanding to the Canary Islands, Africa, and then of course to this continent where we are now. And when these explorers reached those areas, they encountered indigenous peoples who were there, who had pre-existing societies, cultures, ways of governing themselves that were foreign to the Europeans. And the thinkers, largely out of the Vatican, initially, because of the sway that the Catholic Church held in England, or in all of Europe, set out some principles about how to deal with indigenous peoples. And those principles really assumed that it was okay to colonize, that it was okay to come in and take over what was happening because God had blessed that sort of an event and would be giving religion and salvation to indigenous peoples, especially here in the United States. And the problem was, well, if France gets to part of North America at the same time as England does, or about the same time, who gets to deal with the peoples who are there? And essentially what was developed was this doctrine of discovery. It's much maligned and hated, but it's at the foundation of federal Indian law. And what developed out of that aspect of the doctrine of discovery was the notion that whoever got there first got a monopoly in terms of dealing with the indigenous peoples. So when Great Britain proceeded to discover what is now New England and claimed it all the way, in some cases, to the Pacific Ocean, England obtained the right to exclusively deal with the people who were there, and France was not allowed to do so. Well, the French went up north to Canada and got a stakehold there, made claims further down into what became the United States, and that ended up in what we call the French and Indian War that ended in 1763, with the United States predecessor, Great Britain, obtaining title to all of the claims from the New England seaboard to the Mississippi River, where France and Spain had claims until the Louisiana Purchase was accomplished. But that doctrine of discovery was the building block for international dealings with tribes. And so the European nations that came in entered into treaties with the indigenous tribes of New England. And so you'll see the colonies of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and so on entering into treaties of peace and friendship in order to obtain the assistance of the indigenous folks. And as time went by and native tribes fell victim to these terrible European diseases that they hadn't encountered before, their numbers waned, and the Europeans began to enter into treaties of cession with the tribes to acquire some of their land, and that process built up through the 17th century and into the period of the Revolutionary War. It's very interesting to see that right after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the colony, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, entered into a treaty with tribes from Maine in order to obtain their assistance in fighting the British, and at least to get them to promise not to join with the British in what became the War of Independence. And after that, we get a rapid increase in treaty making between colonies and tribes, then states and tribes to some extent, and then after the Constitution is adopted in 1789, treaty making with tribes became exclusively the province of the federal government, of the United States national government. The idea was that it was not a good thing for these individual states and colonies to be negotiating with the tribes. There was often double dealing, mistrust, and a great deal of violence that grew out of tense relationships between the locals and the tribal government. So the federal government put itself in a position through the Constitution of having the exclusive power to deal with Indian affairs through the Indian Commerce Clause in the Constitution, but also through the Treaty Clause.
So, am I right in thinking that there's, even in the doctrine of discovery, there's a presupposition that the discovering power, whatever deals it has already negotiated with pre-existent Indian nations or indigenous nations in that territory, could then transfer that to another nation, as happened in the Louisiana Purchase? Is that what happened in legal terms?
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. With when the United States acquired the Louisiana Purchase, it acquired what France and Spain had, which were some deals with tribes in parts of the area, and in other areas not so much. Same with Florida, when that was acquired from Spain, and the portions of California that were acquired later on as well. And right up to Alaska in 1867, which was acquired subject to existing federal law, but there were no agreements between Russia and the indigenous Alaska natives. Their claims were not settled until 1971 through a modern statute that I call a treaty substitute.
The so-called doctrine of discovery sounded a bit like finders keepers to me, but I still could not understand how the supposedly Christian nations of the 17th and 18th centuries could justify applying this concept, not to things, but to whole groups of people, and riding roughshod over their cultures. So over lunch, I put the question to Virgil Benoit. Do you have any insight about why that might be, Virgil? Why would that be? Why would it be that civilized nations, otherwise civilized nations, somehow didn't bring some of that civilization to bear when they encountered the indigenous people here in North America?
Well, it's partly associated with the term civilization, which really means cityness. Okay. Cityness, as opposed to countryness. And you can go far back into history and the stories we have of people traveling. When they reach out from the city and into the countryside, there is always a bias. And they feel that if they have experienced the life of the city, that they are somehow, and you'll grasp it right away, the sense of it, civilized. And the word carries with it a certain prejudice, a bias already, in favor of what it means to be from the city. So that when our ancestors come to North America, you talk about the uncitied. In English, that becomes, in other words, the uncivilized. But one must understand that not as a hostile statement necessarily. It certainly can become that, especially when you turn to modern uses of the words like the people who live in the uncitied are savages. And of course, words are changing all the time. And the word savage in the films of the 60s and 50s was terrible. Now, really, the origin of that is based on the bias between the city and the country life. And this exists just not in North American experience, but in the Roman language, the Latin language. If you went to the country, you went to meet the pagans. And pagan is a word for countryside. It's the same root. So those who were not believers in the city system, or what was becoming powerful in the cities, and at one point it was the Christian church, then you were equivalent of being uncivilized. And in this case, it was unchurched. And so there's been this tug between the city and the countryside. And the big theme, one of the big themes in North American literature and stories in our civilization, is the concept of the wilderness. And that brings us back to these prejudices between those who are educated in the city and frequently those who brought the sense of treaties and what they should. The next step after treaty was a territory, and after a territory you had a state. These ideas were moving and assured that they would get into place by people who were carrying the knowledge of how you did that. And so when Ramsay comes to Old Crossing, Ramsay is part of a group that knows full well what it's doing from one step to the next. You go from a wilderness to a territory to a state.
But he actually in the course of his discourse with them, he actually refers to the Ojibwe people as savages. He uses that terminology.
Well, yes, but the word itself means different things through time. I mean, once movies come around and you see what it means to the word visualize as savage, it's not that happy a term. It wasn't happy for Ramsay's time either for most people, but
well, even George Washington called indigenous people savage beasts. So used in that context, savage and beast together, does that mean a wild person or somebody who's uncivilized? I think it carried that tonation from way back in the new colonies and people coming over and referencing indigenous people. It wasn't like a misunderstanding or misinterpretation or a literal, but yeah, everybody knew what they meant when they called us savages, wild beasts and people who were not on the same intellect as the more civilized people.
And that's a tremendous disadvantage for a civilization to be thrust into the consideration of those who would look upon it from the outside as to whether or not those people are even human. And so people who study these matters are totally in agreement with what is said here. And your character in your novel is very much perplexed by these major questions of whether or not blacks or native peoples are even human. And civilizations in Europe dealt with that for centuries. And when they came to the wilderness, what an advantage to consider you were not dealing with human beings. And so you've got to overcome all that. But the situation is much better today than it was in terms of trying to work with diversity. And we have authors who create characters who are a little more complex than some of those that just overwhelmed and overrode through whatever power and thinking they had at their disposition. But anyway, that's some reflection.
I think, thank you, that's helpful. I think that,
to dehumanize somebody makes it a heck of a lot easier to take their lands.
Right.
If they don't have the value and they're seen in a lesser light than other people, I suppose, then that justifies the actions of governments. And you're right, it's happened all over the world, in South Africa, and the Aborigines, and the devaluing of people of color over time. They don't understand any of this stuff. They don't value the land. Even John Locke talked about this. He said, everything has to have value. And if you're not taking advantage of the land the way God intended for it to be used, then you don't deserve to have the land. Because God wants us to reap this land, and He wants the fruits to go to the people. And if this is being laid to waste, these people who are in possession of these territories have no right to it, because God believes this land should be used for the betterment of the people. So we're right by taking these lands from these indigenous people, because they don't know how to use it. There's no value in it. They don't value it. See, that's the part where, on the flip side, you look at indigenous people. You know, they valued something as simple as a small brook, a rock, a frog, and there was total value in everything. So they contradict one another, and I think that's where indigenous people were just befuddled by the notion that, well, you can take something like that and just put $1 on it. We don't understand that. That just is not. It just doesn't compute with us that they want this for certain purposes, and it seems to be tied to money somehow.
It was walking around the Why Treaties Matter exhibition that I noticed a rather troubling summary of 19th century American values. The Dakota physician, Ohiesu, also known as Dr. Charles Alexander Eastman, born in Minnesota in 1858, quoted his uncle saying, "The greatest object of their lives seems to be to acquire possessions, to be rich. They desire to possess the whole world."
Because I teach Indian history at the University of Minnesota, and specifically courses related to Minnesota, when I prepared my comments today, thinking about this commemorating the anniversary of the Old Crossing Treaty, I was really just thinking about this era of the mid-19th century, and how it was a time when there was a big demographic shift in Minnesota. And a lot of these changes were coming very rapidly, which is what I wanted to emphasize. That Native people went from being, and Ojibwe and Dakota people in Minnesota, from being the majority, from being the political authorities, they were it, right, in this region. And then you start to see new settlement coming to Minnesota after 1850, and that really intensifies after 1860.
What was the attraction for Minnesota, as you understand it?
Well, I think it was just what was available. The East was settled, and so land was available in Minnesota, and they took the land. And a decade later, Minnesota was filled up, and so they went to North Dakota. I think they just took the nearest land that was open. I don't think it was any draw of Minnesota, especially, although the climate is similar to Norway. The average farm a farm in Norway could have been 5 acres. And you think of raising a family of 8 or 10 children on 5 acres. To come here and get 160 acres in the Homestead Act was wonderful riches. They just couldn't comprehend. Only the very wealthiest people in Norway would have that much land. So to them, they felt they were really getting something for nothing, just for their hard work.
As my own journey progressed, I was shocked by many of the things I heard. If I had known there were dark moments in Minnesota's history, I had no idea quite how many. And then Barry Babcock started telling me about Alexander Ramsey's activities prior to Old Crossing, when he was the first territorial governor of Minnesota.
By 1849, Ramsey, fur trade's ended now. What they see in the Indians is putting them all together because they could make a lot of money off them. I think it was in 1860 or early 1860s, Charles Ruffey, a trader, a licensed trader by the Office of Indian Affairs for the Ojibwe, bragged he could make $75,000 a year just off fleecing Indians. $75,000 a year back then. Imagine what that is today. So that's what all this stuff was. Ramsey, besides being territorial governor, also was the territorial superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs. So besides being governor of the territory, he was in charge of all the Indians in the territory. So he wanted them all moved here because if he could concentrate them at one place, first Leech Lake, then they realized that wasn't going to work. They wanted them on the Mississippi somewhere because of transportation means. They get up and down the river a lot easier than walking through the woods. There were no roads then. He put them at Big Sandy. So they had, I don't know, about 1,000 Indians they brought there, including like the Fond du Lac band from in that Duluth area, Duluth Superior area. We wanted them there because they could fleece them there. And you know, all this money that these Indian traders, whenever a president would change, all these people wanted to be appointees in the Office of Indian Affairs because they didn't know a damn thing about Indians. All they knew, if they got that political appointment, they're going to make a lot of money off the Indians. And it was illegally that they were doing by making this money. So when Ramsey got here, he wanted to move he wanted this removal act. He wanted to put all these Indians at Sandy Lake because it would be a lot easier to exploit them there and fleece them.
And so this was Indian money and annuity, not just Indian land, was very important in the making of Minnesota in the mid-19th century. So they called all the Ojibwe who were eligible for this annuity payment into Sandy Lake, but they did so fairly late in the year. And the Ojibwe were trapped, essentially, for 6 weeks when starvation, illness began to occur because food and those annuities the federal government promised failed to arrive. This single event resulted in the death of 12% of the Wisconsin Indian population, 12%. And for people who lived up the Mississippi, there's evidence that bands at Leech Lake, folks in this part of the country were affected by this as well.
I mean, we know what happened at there. The Sandy Lake Death March, anywhere from 400 to 700 Ojibwe died. And while all of this was going on, the disease, the measles, I think whooping cough, I mean, people were starving to death, dying of disease, those that froze to death in that death march in December, and it was a bitterly cold December. While this was going on, Ramsey was at home celebrating Christmas. So, I mean, that gives you a little bit about the idea where Ramsey is here.
And today we might refer to the Sandy Lake tragedy, which is seldom taught in Minnesota history. It's seldom remembered by any people other than Ojibwe people. But today we might call this an episode of ethnic cleansing.
In southern Minnesota, when the U.S.-Dakota conflict broke out, the U.S. government actually had food that they were supposed to disperse to the Dakota. They had money that they owed them, and they refused to release the annuities or the money because they knew they could pressure the Dakota for even more land sales.
So I think those kinds of information are perhaps some of the most troubling things that one comes across.
Right, because it's not just one mean person, it's the government orchestrating a whole policy. Mm-hmm. And they watched, like the Dakota people were taking off their moccasins and boiling them, hoping they could make soup for their kids. It was that bad. And the traders, you know, had this pattern where they would allow people to charge goods on credit, and then they'd show up at the next treaty signing and say, the Indians owe me X. And they would, you know, inflate the charges, and they would be paid first out of the land sales. Sometimes 70, 80% of the money from the sale of land went to non-native traders. And this pattern had been going on one wave of treaty after another. So in 1862, the traders, there was one in particular, Andrew Myrick, who's famous for saying, if the Indians are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung, while they're boiling their moccasins and stuff. So when that conflict broke out, you know, he was one of the first guys to get killed. His mouth was stuffed with grass. the message was pretty clear. But that not just one individual, but that the US government would orchestrate that intentionally to pressure for more land sales. It's outrageous. And if they had distributed the goods and money they had on hand, that would have been enough to avert the entire conflict. But they didn't, because they're playing a game. And the honor of the US nation was something that was sacrificed in that too, not just the lives of Native people.
And so if we reflect even on this single year, 1863, the year of the Old Crossing Treaty, this was a time of terrible violence in Minnesota, and especially great losses for Dakota people in the southern part of the state. Dakota leaders had already negotiated 2 major treaties at the time, one at Mendota and one at Traverse des Sioux. Both of these were negotiated in 1851. And with these 2 treaties, lands were reserved for them along the Minnesota River, right? So Dakota people were supposed to have a homeland as well in the southern part of the state. But when these treaties went to, began to be debated in the United States Senate, the US Senate removed the clause about permanent Dakota reservations in Minnesota, which was incredible, right? To think about negotiating these treaties, surrendering their homeland, and then the debate takes up in Washington, and the Senate says, oh no, you're just living there temporarily. You have no permanent title to your land. So the Dakota were in a very terrible situation as well. And in the summer of 1862, you probably know, especially with all the conversation that has taken place recently about the anniversary of the war, that 600 or so settlers were killed in Minnesota. And in the aftermath of this event, things did not go well for Dakota people.
Now, one of the characters in your book, which I think is modeled on
my great-grandfather, yes,
a real relative, arrives in Minnesota just prior to the time of the Dakota War. Can you begin to sort of unpack what that meant as you've looked into that? What did that war mean for people who were beginning to think that they could settle here?
I think that it's amazing history. My great-grandfather actually came at the end of the Civil War, was not here for the uprising, but for my purposes, I moved him up a few years. But to imagine someone coming here to start over, and they get here, and not only does the Civil War break out, but then a huge Indian War, and all the problems of immigration. I am amazed that anyone survived. They had no support systems. They had no canned goods, basically. They had no money for anything. They were living off the land, eating elm leaves and muskrats. One of the Minnesota governors is reported to have said that anyone who is too good to eat muskrat is too good for Minnesota. So, very difficult times.
Now, we didn't talk too much about that today, but I mean, there were 600 settlers who died in that Minnesota.
And in fact, that number is fluid. In New Ulm, they always say that there were about 1,000. And I talked to the director of the museum there, and he said that when he was growing up, they always heard the number 2,000. And I've been doing research on this for about 10 years now, and the numbers keep going up and down. I do know that Abraham Lincoln told the Congress that 882 settlers had been killed, and on the same newspaper that had the headline, they were reporting more victims found. So it seems odd to me that I'm not sure anyone knows. There was no infrastructure. People didn't know the language. They were just out there living in the middle of nowhere. Who knows if they lived or died or ran away,
What was the, from what you've understood, what was the sense amongst the rest of the settlers as this was unfolding amongst them? I mean, this was...
It was terror, just pure terror. A lot of people left Minnesota during the Dakota War, never to come back. They left, went to the cities. It really was not safe to live in Minnesota till after the Civil War ended, because raids continued. The people of the Dakota tribes were all expelled, taken to Nebraska, after the uprising, except for the people that had actually participated in the war, and they had gone to Dakota, and so they continued to come over the border and raid.
Now, of course, we can look at that, and our sense of justice today leads us, I think, to the correct conclusion that, in fact, there was considerable injustice perpetrated against the Dakota peoples that provoked the uprising. But once the uprising had happened, and then you have this large number of settlers who have been murdered or killed in some way, then you've got the situation of the terror that's been brought on to the population. And to me, that gives, I'm curious now, does that explain the severity of the American government's response, do you feel?
I can't speak for the American government, but I do know that the attitude was that these people are dangerous and we've got to deal with it. You know, I don't think there was any accountability taken that they were the cause of it. I don't think that the American government ever said that we broke the treaty and this brought this upon us. I don't think that was ever spoken.
Strangely enough, the US government did make an apology to Native peoples. However, if it does not show up in historic documents, that's because it was made in a defense appropriations bill in 2009, and the president who signed the bill into law chose not to read the apology publicly. H.R. 3326 reads in part, "The United States, acting through Congress, recognizes that there have been years of official depredations, ill-conceived policies, and the breaking of covenants by the federal government regarding Indian tribes. The United States, acting through Congress, apologizes on behalf of the people of the United States to all Native peoples for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on Native peoples by citizens of the United States."
There were unjust trials held in the early fall of that year. So if the war takes place in August, in September, you have military tribunals set up in Minnesota. In a sense, right on the battlefields where a war had recently taken place. And in that context, Dakota men were being found guilty of murder, rape, and other crimes. They were being tried by the military that had just recently fought a war against them. The military tribunals for the Dakota people ignored the fact that the Dakota were at war with the United States, and they sentenced over 300 Dakota men for execution. I think they say that on one single day in September, I think the tribunals went into early November, that 42 men were sentenced to execution on a single day, right? So that makes for probably not 5 minutes of hearing evidence and that sort of thing. So you can imagine how devastating this was. As you probably know as well, President Lincoln intervened and reduced the number to 38, who were subsequently hanged in late December of 1862. So in Minnesota, of course, we also have the largest mass execution in the history of the United States, with the Dakota hanging at Mankato, when these 38, later added to 40 individuals, would be hanged in the aftermath of all of this violence.
Abraham Lincoln was so frustrated by the problems here in Minnesota, and I found a quote, and I wish I had it to read directly, but basically he said that if he lived and if they survived the Civil War, he was going to deal with the Indian issues.
And did he mean to deal with the Indian agents? Or
no,
did
he meant to bring some justice to the situation.
Because he saw?
Yes, actually Bishop Whipple, Henry Whipple, made it his life's ambition to explain the Indian problems to the government and try to get some justice. It's a real interesting venture to read the newspaper articles because he wrote scathing letters to the editor about the treaties. And I was looking through a little bit of my research last night, and I found a quote where he said about the Red Lake treaties. He said, "From beginning to end, fraud." And he went to Washington and spoke with Lincoln in person. But Lincoln had to put him off. He said that I can't do this until after the war is over. And then he was killed. I like to think that maybe he would have done something. You know, he did free the slaves. Maybe he would have had big enough shoulders to deal with it.
I think our leaders went into those negotiations in 1863 fully aware of the Dakota War, fully aware of the mass hanging at Mankato that took place within the year. And so it's not like they have the kind of communication channels we have today, but yet news like this traveled in a region. And so I think that experience that recent history was very fresh in the mind of our political leaders when they came to this treaty in 1863. And if they didn't know there would be dire consequences, they would never have ceded 11 million acres of land to the United States.
So in a way, they're negotiating, they're looking beyond the issue of the land, and they're saying, what about the survival of our people?
I think they were thinking about future generations. This is something that you see time and again in treaty negotiations with Indian people. They're not just saying, how am I going to get through this in the next 24 hours? What am I going to do? What is my family going to do? But they usually talked about it in terms of generations. They wanted a homeland for Ojibwe people into the future. And so making political decisions based on future generations and what some of their needs may be was part of Indian diplomacy. It was part of the way Native people thought about the world, and you see that reflected in these treaty processes.
And Red Lake has always maintained all leadership throughout, from the chiefs all the way into modern times, is that we're not that stupid that we're going to go to war with the U.S. government. That ain't going to happen. We're smarter than that. We have to look out for our people. We have to look out for our future. We have to protect those that are yet unborn. We have a responsibility to do that. So we're not going to put our people in harm's way. We can't do that. That's irresponsible.
A point that arises in the context of the Dakota War is, are the Indian nations foreign nations or not?
Well, that was a subject of great debate, whether or not the tribes were foreign nations or not for certain aspects of U.S. law. The tribes certainly took the position that they were not states. The federal government acknowledged that they were not states. They were not counted as citizens for purpose of apportioning representatives and senators. They were not citizens of the states, nor citizens of the United States. So what were they? And that was a subject of a famous case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1830s called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, where Georgia was running roughshod over the Cherokee Nation's reservation. They purported to ban the Cherokee government and to abolish its laws. The Cherokees didn't appreciate that. They had made a treaty with the United States in the 1780s that guaranteed a reservation and hunting grounds and a form of government to them. So the Cherokees sued the state of Georgia. In the United States Supreme Court, there were no lower federal courts at the time. They went straight to the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that they were a foreign nation, entitled under the Constitution to bring an original claim against a state, which is provided for. And the Supreme Court denied their status as a foreign nation in an interesting opinion that had 2 votes saying that they were a foreign nation, 2 votes saying that they weren't any sort of a nation or state at all, and then 2 votes by Justice Marshall that indicated that they were a domestic dependent nation. And that's the term that's come down to the modern field of federal Indian law, that they're not states, they're not foreign nations, they're domestic dependent nations with a sui generis legal status.
What in the world does it mean to be a domestic dependent nation?
Well, it means that the tribe is a government with inherent powers that pre-existed the United States, and that the United States, having asserted control over the territory where those tribes are now found, through operation of federal law and the treaty relationship and these court decisions that were promulgated in the 1830s, the tribes are now in a relationship with the federal government that is dependent not in a sense of welfare or something like that, but they're governments that will support one another. So the tribes promise not to align with France or Spain. For its part, the United States promises to protect the tribe from incursions from other countries, but also from competing local governments like states. And so that relationship of political dependence is really what we mean when we talk about domestic dependent nations today.
But at that point of time, even though after that ruling in it's about 1830, wasn't it? After that, still American Indians don't have citizenship, do they?
That's correct. There was no citizenship in a blanket sense until 1923. Even the 14th Amendment, which provides that anyone born in the United States as a U.S. citizen, was said not to apply to Indians who were members of tribes because they were a sovereign without the constitutional system. So it's pretty amazing when you think about this whole situation. Now, the United States made these promises to be protective, but it breached those promises over and over again, and was just a constant pattern of trying to push the tribes farther and farther west as political power and military power on the part of the United States became stronger. They were no longer worried about the tribes aligning with the other foreign nations like France or Britain. So it was a change in the power relationship, but at bottom it is this political relationship that exists between the tribes and the United States, and we've seen a rebirth of that recognition, in the modern era, which I count as starting in about 1970.
I think one of the things that spoke to me very much at the memorial of the signing of the treaty, the way that you put it was that our people have given this gift of 11 million acres to the United States, and that was I was very interested that you put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is a gift, and it is you're conceding some things, and you're accepting the fact that we have to coexist, and then we have done that. But I think part of it too is a big piece that I've heard talked about over the last, especially the last couple decades, is historical trauma, and where you get these Indians walking around and they don't even really fully realize that subconsciously somewhere they're harboring some sort of resentments against white people, and a lot of them don't even know why. They just know that, hey, we've been screwed over, and I don't like white people because of that, and they don't even fully understand it, and they carry this with them. One of the things I spoke to at the Old Crossing Treaty was closure and healing.
History, it's painful to look back, but you can also learn a lot from history. And a lot of Indian people carry with them that trauma, a lot of that historical trauma that they still carry today. A lot of them don't even realize it's happening, but they still hold that. So, but with anything, I've been in recovery for many, many years now from alcohol. But the only way I was able to heal was to recognize that that was affecting my life in a bad way, and I could not move forward with my life until I actually admitted and acknowledged that I had an issue there. So it's good for us as we move forward. We're excited about this because now we're going to do education programs, not only for our schools and our colleges, but also for the state of Minnesota. And we look forward to continuing a good relationship with the state of Minnesota, the citizens here, the people. It's a wonderful park. It's a beautiful place. It feels good being here today.
So these treaties, of course, although the United States ceased to make treaties towards the end of that 19th century, those treaties, every treaty that was signed is still valid.
Exactly. All the treaties are valid. They play out in all sorts of litigation to this day. You know, the United States was not a good treaty partner. You'll sporadically see cases where the United States stood up for the enforcement of treaties with Indian tribes that were their partners in those treaties. But for many years they did not. And we've sort of seen a renaissance in terms of that enforcement of these treaty rights, partly because the tribes have their own lawyers now and are able to vindicate their rights directly in federal court. And the United States, as I mentioned earlier, has since the late 1960s recognized its responsibilities to Indian nations to support these treaty rights that exist.
So where does that put treaties in the spectrum of U.S. law? Where does that put treaties? Where do they come?
Well, treaties are the supreme law of the land. So if they haven't been abrogated by Congress, then whatever is set out in that treaty remains the law of the land. And so frequently we see litigation over fishing rights. In Minnesota with the Mille Lacs case that went to the Supreme Court in 1998, and out here with a long-running series of litigation called U.S. v. Washington, we see tribes that made treaties with the United States back in the 1840s, 1850s, agreed to settle on smaller reservations but guaranteed rights to hunt and fish in their ceded territories or at their usual and accustomed stations out here in Washington. Now those rights are recognized as property rights. They're protected within the fabric of U.S. law as property that may not be taken away, can't be abrogated without the payment of compensation by the United States government. And state law notwithstanding, those rights may be exercised by the respective tribes that are the beneficiaries of those treaties. So it's very powerful rights, and the court has recognized that these were not grants of rights from the United States to the tribes, that the tribes pre-existed the establishment of the United States, and accordingly that the rights retained by the tribes were just that. They were reserved rights, and they should be expansively construed so that anything not explicitly ceded to the United States is retained. So that would include these hunting and fishing rights, along with rights to cross private property to get to areas where you can fish, water rights to ensure that fish remain in rivers and whatnot. It's a very potent tool in the hands of the tribes who want to maintain their traditional lifestyles, their health, their economies, and their cultures.
Treaties are not just ancient contracts, but they're living documents, and so are tribal governments. So there's this ongoing process of negotiating the future for tribes and renegotiating the relationship with the U.S. government. So I think that's the entry point for us to look at making things different from all sides.
Why Treaties was made possible by the Minnesota Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
If you feel you have benefited from watching this documentary, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at lptv.org. Thank you.